Welcome back to Family Ties and Lies, the channel where blood is thicker than water, but secrets are the thickest of all. Every family has a perfect smile for the cameras. But what happens when the doors finally close? We know that behind every flawless holiday dinner lies a hidden web of deception waiting to unravel. Here, we dig into the most shocking family dramas, bitter betrayals, and dark mysteries that people try to bury forever. Whether it is a brutal feud or a hidden past, we uncover the absolute truth. Grab your snack, get comfortable, and hit that subscribe button right now. The ultimate family secrets are about to be exposed. I gave that girl everything I had. I raised her alone after her father was killed. I held the last money he ever left untouched for 34 years, saving it for her. And yet, on the night of my 66th birthday, I stood in a room full of flowers and watched my own daughter stand perfectly still while her husband slipped something into my glass. They thought age had made me blind. I was still her mother, and I saw all of it. My name is Eleanor Brandt. Stay with me. It was 10 minutes to 7 when I stepped through the doors of the Officers Club near Fort Liberty, and the first thing I felt was not joy. It was an old, familiar instinct, the kind that had kept me alive across 40 years of service, the quiet warning that comes before you can name what is wrong. The room was beautiful, I will give them that. A banner stretched across the far wall, white letters on deep blue, reading Happy Birthday, Nora, 66 years. White narcissus stood in glass vases on every table. The lights were soft and gold, the kind of light that makes everyone look kinder than they are. Somewhere a string quartet played something gentle. It was exactly the sort of evening a loving family arranges for a woman they cherish. That was the problem. I knew, in the part of me that had read rooms for 4 decades, that the warmth was a stage set. Someone had built it carefully, and I had spent enough years around careful people to know that the most dangerous ones smile while they work. I steadied myself in the doorway and breathed, the way I had taught 1,000 frightened soldiers to breathe before they walked into something hard. I told myself I was being foolish. I told myself a tired old woman was inventing shadows. 40 years of alarms before dawn, of roll calls and formations, of sleepless nights nursing a baby alone while her father lay in a grave overseas, had perhaps left me unable to trust a quiet, happy room. I almost believed it. Then Marlene found me. She has a way of arriving exactly when I need her. My oldest friend, the one constant across more hard years than either of us likes to count. She took my hand and squeezed it hard and looked at me with the steady eyes of a woman who has buried people beside me and carried me through the bearing. She did not say a word about what I was feeling. She did not have to. She simply stood close, a wall at my shoulder, and let me gather myself. The room began to fill in around us. I recognized faces I had not seen in years. A retired master sergeant who had served under me, grayer now, lifting a glass in salute across the crowd. A nurse from the base hospital. A young man by the windows whose name I would remember in a moment. There is a particular ache in seeing the people your life has touched gathered in one place. All of them living, all of them grown, all of them carrying some small piece of you forward into a world you will not see the end of. For a moment, standing there with Marlene's hand in mine, I let myself hope I was wrong. And then I saw her. Vanessa stood near the center of the room in a deep green dress I had never seen, her dark hair pinned up the way her father used to like. And for one heartbeat, she was simply my daughter, the infant from the Greenwald Hospital, the little girl I had raised on my own pay, one careful dollar at a time. My heart did the thing it has always done at the sight of her, the helpless softening that no betrayal has ever quite managed to kill. Then I saw who stood beside her. Garrett, my son-in-law, 38 years old, broad and easy in an expensive suit, one hand resting comfortably in his pocket, the other curled around a glass he was not drinking from. He was smiling. He was always smiling. It was a good smile, warm at the surface, the kind that makes strangers trust him within a minute of meeting. I had spent 6 years learning to listen underneath it, to the cold and patient thing that lived below the warmth. He saw me in the doorway. He lifted his glass an inch, a small private toast, and his smile widened, and I felt the warning in my chest go quiet and certain, the way a question does the moment it becomes an answer. I had wondered for weeks now whether I was imagining it. The questions that were too kind, the papers Vanessa had asked me to look over, the friend Garrett kept mentioning who handled estates. I had told myself again and again that I was a suspicious old woman who could not let her daughter be happy. I had wanted, with everything left in me, to be wrong. I looked at the two of them standing together under the soft gold lights, in the beautiful room they had built for me, and I knew I had hoped I was wrong. I had been wrong about that. People who have never served imagine that a soldier's life is made of large moments, medals and deployments and the snap of a flag. They are wrong. A life in uniform is made of small things, repeated until they become who you are. The alarm before dawn, the roll call, the boots by the door, always in the same place, so that even half asleep, your hands know where to find them. I married Raymond Brandt in the spring of 1979. He was a sergeant then, broad-shouldered and quiet, the kind of man who said little and meant all of it. We had 3 years and a daughter before the world took him from me. Vanessa was born in 1982 in a base hospital with green walls, while Raymond paced a hallway and pretended he was not afraid. She was not yet a year old when he died. She would grow up with a father made entirely of my stories and a single box of letters. When Raymond was killed, the Army gave me a folded flag and a survivor's benefit. The flag I keep in a cedar box. The money I never touched. For 34 years, it sat where it had been placed, gathering quiet interest, untouched, because it was not money to me. It was the last thing his hands had earned. It was the proof that he had been here, that he had loved us, that he had left us cared for, even from wherever the dead go. To spend it would have been to admit he was truly gone. So I let it sit, and I built our lives on my own pay instead, one careful dollar at a time. I raised our daughter alone. I want to be honest about what that meant, because the women in this room understand it in a way no one else can. It meant being two parents in one tired body. It meant missing things, school plays and scraped knees, because the duty roster did not care that I was the only one she had. It meant a guilt that never fully left, and a love so large it frightened me. Vanessa is 43 now, a grown woman with lines beginning at her eyes, and there are still nights I look at her and see the infant in the green-walled hospital, the one I promised her father I would protect. I tell you all this so you understand what I felt, standing at the edge of my own birthday party, watching her. Because I was watching her, I had not meant to. A mother's eyes find her child in any room, the way a compass finds north, without being asked. And what I saw 3 times in the space of a quarter hour was my daughter drifting toward the drinks table when she thought no one was looking. Not to drink. She held the same untouched glass of wine the whole evening. She would drift close, pause, glance back over her shoulder toward her husband, and drift away again. Small things repeated. That is what a life is made of. It is also, I have learned, what a betrayal is made of. Marlene found me before I could follow the thought all the way down. She has a gift for that, my oldest friend, for arriving in the exact moment I need a hand to hold and a reason to keep my face still. She pressed her shoulder against mine and asked if I was all right, and I told her the truth, which is that I did not yet know. Across the room, Garrett laughed at something. He had a good laugh, my son-in-law, warm at the surface and cold underneath if you knew how to listen. He stood with one hand resting easy in his pocket and the other gesturing as he spoke. A man entirely comfortable, a man who believed the evening was going exactly as he had arranged it. And then the door opened, and a young woman came in, and for the first time all night, my heart lifted instead of tightening. Sergeant Major Brandt. They had called her once, before she earned her own stripes. Tyla Reyes. 4 years ago, she had been a troubled private with a chip on her shoulder and nowhere to put her grief. And I had been the one who refused to let her throw her life away. She crossed the room toward me with the careful, upright walk of someone who has decided to make their life mean something. And I felt the old, fierce pride that has nothing to do with blood and everything to do with the people you choose to save. She was not the only one. As I let my eyes move slowly around that bright room, I began to recognize others. A man by the window I had pulled out of a bad night years ago. A nurse near the bar I had mentored through her first hard deployment. Faces scattered through the crowd that belonged to people who had once needed me and never forgotten it. I am 66 years old. I have buried a husband, raised a daughter alone, commanded soldiers, and counted out 34 years, $1 at a time, never touching the one that mattered most. I had walked into that party feeling old and uncertain and afraid of what I suspected. But standing there, watching Tyla cross the room, watching Vanessa drift one more time toward the drinks table, I felt something else settle into place beneath the fear. I was not alone in that room, whatever was about to happen. I was not nearly as alone as my daughter and her husband believed. I just did not yet know how much I would need every one of those faces before the night was through. "Sergeant Major Brandt," she said again, softer now, as if my name were something she had been saving. "I hoped you would remember me. I would have known her anywhere. Tyla Reyes." She had come to me 4 years earlier as a private with a chip on her shoulder, the size of a footlocker, and a file full of disciplinary notes that other people had already given up on. Everyone had a reason to write her off. I had read the file once, set it aside, and decided to look at the soldier instead of the paper. She had reminded me, even then, of myself at that age. All that anger, and underneath it, a fierce, frightened hunger to matter. "Specialist Reyes," I said, and watched her face break open with pleasure. "It is good to see you in that uniform." She told me in a rush that she had made sergeant, that she was stationed nearby, that she had heard about my retirement party from one of the old hands and had asked, almost shyly, whether she might come. I would not have missed it. "Ma'am," she said, "you were the first person who ever looked at me like I was worth the trouble." I felt that land somewhere deep. There were others like her scattered through the room. I realized as I looked around, soldiers I had mentored, corrected, defended, believed in, a whole quiet network of people who had served under me and carried something of those years forward. I did not know yet how much that would matter before the night was over. I only felt the warmth of it and the strange comfort of being surrounded by people who had once depended on me and now stood, grown and capable, in a room arranged in my honor. Tila was still talking when I felt the temperature of the air change behind me. "Mom," said a voice, smooth, warm, performed. I turned, and there was Garrett. He wore the expression he always wore when he wanted to be seen being a good son-in-law, the slight furrow of concern, the head tilted just enough to signal tenderness. He called me Mom in public. He called me the old woman when he thought I could not hear, a thing I had learned by accident one evening through a half-closed door, and had filed away with all the other small cold facts I was collecting. "Mom," he said, "you should be sitting down. You have been on your feet for ages." He took my elbow, gently, the way you steer someone who can no longer steer themselves. I let him. It cost me something, but I let him, because I had decided weeks ago that I would give these two no reason to think I suspected anything. Tyla's eyes flicked to his hand on my arm, then back to my face. Something in her, some good soldier's instinct, registered a wrongness she could not name. I gave her the smallest shake of my head. "Not now." She held my gaze a half-second longer than was comfortable, then nodded once and stepped back into the crowd. And I knew she would be watching. Garrett walked me toward a chair near the windows. As we went, his eye fell on the small object resting beside my clutch on the table. It was an old notebook, army green, the cover soft and furred at the corners from decades of being carried in pockets and packs. I had kept one like it my entire career, a place for names, dates, details, the small facts that win and lose everything. I had never broken the habit. He picked it up before I could stop him, turning it over in his hands with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Still scribbling in your little book?" "Mom," he said, "you know they make apps for this now." His thumb riffled the worn pages. Careless. Dismissive. "It is sweet." "Really?" "Like a security blanket." He set it back down with the particular gentleness people reserve for the harmless possessions of someone they have already decided is fading. I looked at that notebook lying on the cream tablecloth, and I felt something in me go very still and very calm. He had no idea. He genuinely believed it was the sentimental clutter of a woman whose best years were behind her. He had handled it the way you handle a child's drawing, with that soft contempt dressed up as affection. He did not know that for 2 years I had been writing in that book. He did not know it held dates, account names, the exact wording of conversations I had transcribed afterward while they were still fresh, withdrawals that did not add up, questions Vanessa had asked too casually about my finances, my will, the survivor's benefit. The afternoon I had come home and known, with a certainty I could not prove, that someone had been through my papers. The thing he had just mocked was the most complete and damning record anyone could have assembled, kept in the steady hand of a woman who had spent 40 years learning that the difference between surviving and being buried is almost always written down by someone who is paying attention. "Thank you, Garrett," I said, settling into the chair. "You are always so thoughtful." The words came out warm and easy. He smiled, satisfied, patted my shoulder once, and drifted back toward Vanessa. I let my hand rest on the cover of the notebook. The green canvas was soft under my fingers, familiar as my own pulse. Across the room, my son-in-law leaned down to murmur something in my daughter's ear, and she laughed, and the sound traveled across the warm gold air and found me where I sat. I am 66 years old. They had looked at me and seen a woman at the end of her usefulness, a soft target, a balance to be transferred, a signature to be obtained, a mind that could be made to look unreliable in front of a judge. They had looked at me, and they had seen something small. I picked up my water glass, smiled at no one in particular, and began, very quietly, to count the things that did not add up. It had started so quietly that for a long time I told myself it was nothing. The first thing was a question. A little more than 2 years ago, at a Sunday dinner, Vanessa had asked me lightly, over the gravy, whether I had ever thought about what would happen to the house. "Just in case," she said, "just so things were not a mess later." It was a reasonable question, the kind any grown child might ask an aging parent. I had answered it carefully and changed the subject, and she had let it drop. And I had thought about it for 3 weeks afterward without quite knowing why. Then there were more questions, always gentle, always wrapped in concern. Did I have a financial advisor? Had I updated my will lately? Who held power of attorney in case something happened? Garrett asked some of them, in that warm voice of his, leaning in like a man who only wanted to help carry a burden too heavy for my failing shoulders. Once he mentioned, almost in passing, a friend of his who handled estate matters, who could come by sometime and just take a look at how things were structured. No pressure, he said, just to make your life easier. I am 66 years old. I have sat across the table from men who wanted things from me my entire adult life, and I have learned to hear the difference between a question and a probe. These were probes. They were mapping me. They were learning the terrain of my life, the way I had once taught young soldiers to read ground before they crossed it, noting the cover, the high points, the places a person could fall. But it was more than questions. There were the phone calls that had grown strange. Vanessa had started calling more often, which should have warmed me and instead unsettled me, because there was something rehearsed in them, something effortful. She would ask how I was feeling. She would ask more than once in a single call whether I was remembering to take my medications, whether I had felt confused lately, whether I had been forgetting things. She asked it the way you plant a seed and then check the soil. And slowly, so slowly, I almost did not catch it. I began to understand that she was not asking because she was worried I was slipping. She was asking so that later she could say she had been worried for a long time. That was the afternoon it stopped being unease and became something with a name. I was standing in my kitchen, the phone still warm in my hand, and the word arrived in my mind fully formed, cold and clinical and terrible. Conservatorship. I knew what it was. I had watched it happen to a woman from my church, a sharp, proud woman 2 years older than me, whose son had stood before a judge with a folder of carefully collected concerns and walked out holding the legal right to control every dollar she spent, every decision she made, where she lived, what she ate. They said it was for her protection. Within a year, she was in a facility she had not chosen, and the house she had lived in for 50 years had been sold, and no one could quite explain where the money had gone. She died 18 months later. I had visited her near the end. She had looked at me with eyes that were perfectly clear and said, "They told everyone I could not think straight. Nora, I can think straight. No one will listen to me anymore." I had driven home from that visit and sat in my car in the driveway for a long time. So when my own daughter began asking, in that careful, rehearsed voice, whether I had been feeling confused, I understood exactly what ground was being mapped and exactly what they intended to build on it. They needed a record. They needed witnesses who would later say, yes, the family had been concerned for some time. They needed a moment, a single dramatic moment, where the strong and competent woman everyone respected appeared in front of people to come undone, to slur and stumble and lose herself. And from that moment, a judge's signature, and from that signature, everything, the survivor's benefit, the pension, the house, the untouched account that held the last warm thing I had of Raymond. All of it transferred into the hands of the people who had decided that a woman of my age was no longer entitled to govern her own life. I had not told anyone. That was the loneliest part. And I want to be honest about it because I think there are women listening who know exactly the particular silence I am describing. Who do you tell? You cannot go to the police with a feeling. You cannot say, "My daughter asks about my medications," in a tone I do not like. They would look at you the way the world looks at frightened old women, with pity, and they would gently suggest that perhaps you were a little confused. The very accusation I feared would be confirmed by my attempt to fight it. So I carried it alone. I wrote it down, and I began very privately to prepare. Because if there is one thing 4 decades in uniform teaches you, it is that you do not win the battle on the day of the battle. You win it in all the quiet days before, when no one is watching, when you are doing the unglamorous work of gathering what you will need. I sat in that gold-lit room on the evening of my 66th birthday, my hand resting on a green canvas notebook, full of the proof no one believed I had, and I watched my son-in-law cross the room toward the drinks table. It was the 3rd time he had gone to it. I watched him pick up a champagne flute. I watched him glance, just once, over his shoulder, the way a man glances when he is about to do something he does not want seen. And I went very, very still. I want to tell you exactly what I saw, because the precision of it matters. It matters because afterward, people would ask me again and again whether I was certain, whether perhaps I had misunderstood, whether a woman my age standing in a dim room full of champagne might not have simply imagined a thing she was already afraid of. So I will be precise. The time was 42 minutes past 7. I know because I had just glanced at the small watch on my wrist, an old habit, the soldier's reflex of always knowing the hour. Garrett stood at the drinks table with his back mostly to the room, not fully, not in a way that would have looked strange to anyone who was not watching the way I was watching, just angled, just enough. His left hand rested flat on the white tablecloth. His right hand was the one that moved, and his eyes, I noticed, were not on the glass in front of him at all. His eyes were up, sweeping the room, traveling across the gathering the way a man's eyes travel when he is watching for the one thing he does not want to be seen doing. They passed over me. I had already let my own gaze go soft and unfocused, turned 3/4 away, a woman half listening to the conversation beside her, present and harmless. His eyes slid past me without catching, and in the moment his attention was elsewhere, his right hand tilted. It was the smallest motion. If you had not been looking for it, you would have seen a man adjusting a drink. Nothing more. But I saw the fold of his body inward, the way he curved himself around the act to shield it. I saw a small object catch the gold light for half a second between his fingers, pale and slight, before it disappeared back into the breast of his jacket. I saw the deliberate care with which he then straightened that one particular flute, nudging it forward, setting it slightly apart from the others, more accessible, easier to reach, easier to hand to someone without having to fumble among the rest. The kind of placement that says, without a single word, "This one is meant for someone." My heart did not pound. I want you to understand that because I think people expect the body to betray you in a moment like that, expect the racing pulse and the trembling hands. Mine did the opposite. Everything in me went quiet and slow and very, very clear. the way it had gone clear in the worst moments of 40 years. The moments when panic was a luxury I could not afford, and clarity was the only thing that might keep someone alive. I did not move. I did not make a sound. I have spent too many years in rooms full of people who would have been glad to see me flinch, and I learned a long time ago that the most powerful thing you can do, sometimes the only thing, is to refuse to give them the reaction they are counting on. So I stood still, and I watched, and I let my mind do what it had been trained for 4 decades to do. I cataloged the container back into the jacket, the glass, straightened, set forward, marked. The way he stepped back from the table and rejoined a knot of laughing men without missing a beat, picking up the thread of some story as though he had never left it. The performance of an innocent man at a party, flawless, practiced. And while my face stayed soft and my hands stayed easy at my sides, the cold, clear part of me was already running the arithmetic of it, already understanding what that glass was for, already understanding the shape of the evening they had built, brick by brick, around me. Because here is what they intended. I saw it whole. In the space of a few breaths, when the toast came, when the room raised its glasses to the woman of the hour, someone would hand me a glass, and Garrett had made certain it would be that glass, the one set forward and apart, the one waiting. I would drink, and sometime after, in front of all these people, in front of the old soldiers and the church friends and my own daughter, I would begin to slur, to sway, to lose the thread of my own sentences, the competent woman, the commander, the matriarch, coming apart in public. And there would be Vanessa, eyes wet with practiced worry, saying she'd been frightened for so long. And there would be Garrett, steady and concerned, already reaching for his phone, already knowing which number to call. And there would be witnesses, a whole room of them, who would later swear in good faith that yes, the poor woman had not seemed herself, that the family had clearly been carrying something heavy, a moment. They needed a single moment, and from that moment, a folder of concerns, and from that folder, a hearing, and from that hearing, a signature, and from that signature, my whole life, signed over to the man who had married my daughter and the daughter I had carried beneath my own heart. They had thought of everything. They had thought of everything except one thing. They had forgotten who they were dealing with. They had looked at the gray hair and the careful steps and the navy dress, and they had let themselves believe the lie that the world tells about women like me, that we soften, that we fade, that the edge dulls and leaves behind only sentiment and a fading memory. I looked at that glass, set forward and waiting on the white cloth, gleaming softly in the gold light. I looked at my son-in-law, laughing among the men, certain of his evening. I let 42 minutes past 7 hang in the still clear air of my mind. Then I began to count, slowly, to 45, and I made a plan. 45 seconds. I gave myself exactly that, and I counted every one of them, because a woman in a hurry draws eyes, and a woman simply making her way through her own party draws none. When I reached the end of the count, I rose from the chair near the window the way an older woman rises, unhurried, one hand resting briefly on the table for balance. Let them see that. Let them see the careful movements of a body they believed was failing. I smoothed my dress. I picked up my clutch, and I began to drift toward the drinks table along a path that was not a path, stopping twice on the way. The first stop was an old master sergeant I had served with in another lifetime, who gripped my hand and told me a story I had heard 4 times before, and I let him tell it, nodding, laughing in the right place. The second stop was beside a flower arrangement near the window, which I admired aloud to no one in particular. I was not crossing the room. I was wandering through my own celebration, a sentimental woman pausing to touch the roses. Nothing more. And then I was at the table. The glass was exactly where he had left it, set forward, set apart, gleaming softly among the others, waiting to be picked up and pressed into my hand. I looked at it for one steady moment. Then I did the thing I had been planning since the count began. I opened my clutch as though searching for something, a tissue, a lipstick, the small, ordinary fumbling of an old woman's purse. And under cover of that motion, I took out a small, empty pill bottle. I had carried empty bottles in my bag for years, the residue of a dozen prescriptions, the clutter that no one ever questions in the handbag of a woman my age. I had emptied this one before I left the house that evening, though at the time I had not let myself fully name why. With my body angled the way his had been angled, shielding the act the way he had shielded his, I tipped a measure of the champagne from that marked glass into the little bottle, capped it, and let it disappear back into my clutch. A sample, evidence, preserved before anything could be cleaned away, before the glass could be washed or swept or made to vanish in the chaos I already knew was coming. Whatever he had put in that drink, I now carried a portion of it on my own person, sealed and quiet. Then I picked up the marked glass itself. I carried it a few steps along the table and set it down behind one of the centerpiece arrangements, where it was visible but not easily reached, tucked among the greenery like a thing forgotten. And I took up the flute that had been sitting beside where the marked one stood, an ordinary glass, an innocent glass, and I moved it forward into the place of honor, set it apart, made it accessible, made it to any eye that came looking. The glass meant for the woman of the hour, a quiet switch, the kind no one notices unless they were the one who set the trap and know exactly where every piece is supposed to be. I stepped back from the table. My hands were perfectly steady. That still surprises me when I remember it. I found Marlene in the crowd and crossed to her, and I put my hand on her arm, and I said, in a voice low and even, "Marlene, I need you to stay close to me for the rest of this evening. Very close." She looked at me, really looked in that way she had of seeing past the surface of a thing. "How close?" she asked. "Within reach," I said, "and do not drink anything from that table." She held my eyes for a moment. Then she said, simply, "All right." And she moved to my side and stayed there, and she asked no further questions. And I have rarely in my life loved anyone the way I loved her, in that small, unhesitating moment. It was only then, with the glass switched and the sample sealed, and Marlene anchored at my shoulder, that I let myself feel the full weight of what they were reaching for. because it was not only the pension, it was not only the house. I had understood. In the kitchen weeks before, with the phone still warm in my hand, the true shape of what they meant to take. The survivor's benefit, Raymond's money, the account I had never touched in 34 years. I thought of the morning they folded the flag and placed it in my hands, of how the triangle of cloth had weighed almost nothing and yet had nearly driven me to my knees. I thought of all the years I had let that money sit untouched, faithful and waiting, because spending it would have meant admitting he was truly gone, and I had not been able to do that, and so I had kept it the way you keep a hand that is no longer warm. It was the last thing of his I still held. And Garrett, my son-in-law, who called me Mom in public and the old woman through half-closed doors, had decided that the last warm thing I had of my husband was an asset, a balance, a number to be transferred into his own account. Once a judge declared me unfit to know my own mind. I felt the anger then. Not the hot reactive kind that makes a person stupid. The other kind. The cold kind. The kind that settles in the chest like a stone and makes everything terribly, perfectly clear. The kind that does not shout because it has no need to. The kind that says, very quietly, you are not going to get away with this. Not tonight. Not with his money. Not with what is mine. Across the room, a small bell chimed against crystal. Someone was calling for quiet. The toast was about to begin. A quick note on the word count before the story. I can hit a precise target reliably for short passages, but for a piece this long, no language model can truly count its own words to the exact token. I draft and estimate carefully, but the honest reality is that the final count may land a word or two off from exactly 1,020. I'll get it as close as I can and report the count truthfully, rather than claim a precision I can't guarantee. If you need an ironclad 1,020, the surest path is to paste the output into a word counter and tell me to add or trim a specific number, which I can do exactly. Here is the revised Task 7, written in American English with all numbers spelled out, aiming for 1,020 words. I have planned operations in my life. Not large ones, not the kind that make history, but the kind that keep ordinary people alive on an ordinary Tuesday. And the first rule of any plan is the one no one ever wants to hear out loud. You do not control everything. You control what you can. You prepare carefully for what you cannot. And you make your peace with the gap between them before it opens wide under your feet. I thought I had closed every gap that night. I was wrong, and a young woman I loved nearly paid for it with her life. Standing near the bar with my switched glass held loosely in my hand, I let my eyes move slowly across the bright, crowded room, and I quietly counted the faces I had placed there. Tyla, near the tall windows now, talking with the easy warmth of a woman who had decided to live. Doyle by the door, a big and watchful man I had pulled out of a very bad year a full decade ago. A military policeman, off duty tonight, leaning against the far wall with a beer he was not drinking. A base nurse near the coat check, who had once trembled through her first hard deployment under my steady eye. They did not look like a plan. That was precisely the point. They looked like ordinary guests at a quiet birthday party. But I had made certain, in the careful days before this evening, that the people I trusted most in the world would be inside this room when the moment came that I needed them. I had suspected what was coming for weeks. I had not been able to prove a single word of it, and so I had done the only thing a careful old woman can do. I had stacked the room in my favor, and I had waited to see whether I was wrong. I was not wrong. The little bell chimed. Vanessa stepped to the front, near the bright banner with my name and my 66 years printed across it, and lifted her glass for the toast. I have to tell you that her words were beautiful. That is the part that still aches inside me. She spoke about a mother who raised her alone, who never once made her feel the heavy weight of it, who taught her quietly that real strength is gentle. She spoke about the survivor's benefit her father had left behind, though she did not name it as that, and how I had carried it untouched for 34 long years out of nothing but love. The whole room went soft and warm. People dabbed at their eyes. My own daughter stood there and said true things about me with a glass in her hand, and I could not tell, even then, even knowing everything I knew, how much of her actually believed them. That is the deep cruelty of it. The lie and the love had grown into each other so completely that even she could no longer pull the two of them apart. When she finished, Garrett crossed the floor to me, warm and easy, and pressed a glass of champagne firmly into my hand, the ordinary one, the harmless one I had set in the place of honor with my own hands. He did not know that it was harmless. He believed he was handing me the very end of my life, and he smiled at me while he did it. And he called me Mom in front of the entire room. I lifted it. I let the cold rim touch my lips. I did not drink. I have spent 40 years learning how to appear to do a thing without ever truly doing it. And I appeared, to every single eye in that room, including his, to take a long and grateful swallow of my own poison. I set the glass down, and I waited patiently for him to relax. He did. I watched the relief move through his shoulders, small and certain. The posture of a man who believed the hard part was safely behind him now. That was the exact moment the gap opened. I had hidden the poisoned flute behind the tall centerpiece at the far end of the table, tucked back where no curious guest would ever reach for it, where it could sit quietly until Holloway's people came to bag it as evidence. I had genuinely thought that was enough. But a banquet is a living, moving thing, full of busy hands I did not command. And one of those hands belonged to a young man in a white server's jacket who was clearing the table and tidying as he went. He saw a single glass set back and forgotten behind the flowers. He did the helpful, ordinary, terrible thing. He drew it forward and set it neatly at the very front of the table, out in the open, among all the others, ready to be taken. I saw it happen, and my whole body went cold as winter before I could move, before I could cross the small distance and knock it from the white cloth, or call out something that would not turn every head sharply toward me. Tyla drifted over from the windows. She had been talking and laughing, her throat dry the way anyone's gets at a long party. She reached for the nearest glass without a single thought in the world. The faded one. The one Garrett had carefully filled. The one I had hidden, and a kind stranger had unhidden in one careless, gentle motion. I opened my mouth. 40 years of command behind me. And in the one short second that mattered most of all, no order came fast enough. She lifted it. She smiled at something Doyle said across the room, and she drank. For a few seconds, nothing happened. That is the cruelest part of poison, the waiting. The room went on around me, warm and golden and oblivious, glasses lowering, conversation starting back up, my daughter stepping down from the microphone to a ripple of applause. And Tyla stood near the wall, finishing her sip, laughing at whatever her friend had said, alive and unknowing. I was already moving toward her. Not quickly. Even then, even with my heart in my throat, the discipline held, because a woman crossing a room in a panic creates a panic, and I needed the room calm for what was coming. I went the way I had gone to the drinks table, unhurried, drifting, but every part of me was bent toward that young woman by the wall, willing the seconds to slow. It was Doyle who saw it first. The old first sergeant had never taken his eyes off the room, and he was watching Tyla, the way I had taught 1,000 soldiers to watch the people around them. And so he was already turning toward her when she put her hand out and found the back of a chair. She blinked. She brought her free hand up to her temple. "Sergeant," said the friend beside her, the smile sliding off her face. "Tyla, you okay?" And Tyla said, in a voice that had gone strange and thick at the edges, "I feel really weird all of a sudden. Really weird." The words came out slurred and slow, and she swayed, and her knees began to give. Doyle caught her before she hit the floor, and then the room understood that something was wrong, and the warmth went out of it all at once, the way heat leaves a room when a window breaks. There was a sharp intake of breath somewhere. A glass shattered. Voices rose, overlapping. Someone shouted for water. Someone else was already pulling out a phone. The nurse from the base hospital was suddenly there, on her knees beside Tyla, 2 fingers at the young woman's throat, her voice cutting clean and professional through the rising noise. "She's breathing. Pulse is fast. Has she had anything? Has anyone seen what she had to drink?" And in the middle of all of it, in the eye of that gathering storm, I stopped moving. I stood very still in the center of the room, and I did the one thing that mattered most in that moment. I looked for my son-in-law. He was standing perhaps 15 feet away, and his face had gone somewhere I had never seen it go in 6 years. Not panic, not guilt. Something worse than either. Something that turned my stomach even as it confirmed everything. His face had gone to calculation. I could see the machinery of it working behind his eyes, the rapid, frantic reassessment of a man whose careful plan had just struck the wrong target. His gaze went to Tyla on the floor, then to the drinks table, then, searching, sweeping to me, and our eyes met. I let him see it. For the first time all evening, I let the soft, harmless mask fall away. Just for him. Just for that one held second. And I let my son-in-law look into my face and see that I knew. Everything. The container. The marked glass. the plan. I let him see the commander who had been standing inside the grateful old woman the entire time, watching him, cataloging him, waiting. I watched the understanding hit him. I watched him grasp, in that single second, that the glass on the floor was not where it was supposed to be, that the woman of the hour was standing upright and clear-eyed and unharmed, that something had gone profoundly and catastrophically wrong with a plan he had believed was perfect. And I watched him understand, finally, far too late, that he had badly misjudged the woman he had married into. Then his eyes moved past me, and I followed them, and they landed on Vanessa. My daughter stood frozen near the foot of the microphone stand, and she was not looking at Tyla on the floor. She was looking at Garrett, and then she was looking at me. And in her face I saw the whole terrible thing arrive all at once. Saw her eyes go from her husband to her mother and back. Saw the dawning horror of a woman realizing in real time exactly what had been done and exactly who it had been meant for. Her hand had risen to her mouth. She had gone white to the lips. The three of us stood there, suspended, in a triangle across that chaotic room. Garrett, who had done it, Vanessa, who had let it be done, and me, who had seen it coming and turned it aside. The noise roared around us, people calling Tyla's name, the nurse issuing orders, someone counting breaths aloud. But in the small, still space between the three of us, there was no noise at all. There was only the terrible silent knowledge passing between us, clear as a struck bell. All three of us knew. Garrett knew that I knew. Vanessa knew what her husband had done, and that I had known long before she did. And I knew, looking at the ruin on both their faces, that whatever this family had been for 6 years was over, that it had ended in this exact moment, on the floor of a room arranged to celebrate my life. Then the spell broke. Garrett took a step toward Tyla, his hands coming up, his mouth already shaping some performance of a concerned bystander. "Let me help. Is she all right? Someone call an ambulance." I turned away from him. I walked, steady and unhurried, toward the nurse kneeling on the floor beside my soldier. And as I went, I caught Doyle's eye, and I gave him the smallest nod, the signal I had told them all to watch for. "Secure the table," I said, low enough that only he could hear. "Nothing gets cleaned. Nothing gets moved." And the trap I had built began, quietly, to close. I knelt beside Tyla on the floor, and I took her hand, and I spoke to her the way I had spoken to frightened soldiers for 40 years, low and steady and certain. "You are going to be all right," I told her. "Help is coming. I have you." Her eyes found mine, unfocused and afraid, and some part of her, even in that fog, recognized the voice, and she gripped my fingers and held on. The nurse looked up at me. "Her vitals are holding, ma'am," she said, "but we need her to a hospital, and we need to know what she took." I met the nurse's eyes and said, quietly, so only she could hear, "It was not what she took. It was what was given to her. I will explain right now. Keep her stable." Then I rose, and I became, for the rest of that evening, the thing I had been trained across 4 decades to be, Not a grieving woman, not a frightened one. A commander in the middle of a crisis, moving with the cold economy of someone who has done hard things in hard places and knows that panic is a luxury that costs lives. I found the venue's head of security, a broad, quiet man named Holloway, who had the look of someone who had seen most things and been impressed by few of them. I did not raise my voice. I said, "There is a young woman who has collapsed after drinking from a glass at that table. I need that table secured immediately. Nothing washed, nothing cleared, nothing moved. I need the glass she drank from kept exactly where it fell, and I need the security footage for this room for the last 90 minutes preserved before anyone touches the system." Holloway looked at me for a moment, the way people look when they are deciding whether someone has the authority to be giving orders. Then something in my face settled the question for him, and he said, "Yes, ma'am," and he moved. Doyle was already standing over the table, broad shoulders squared, turning back anyone who drifted toward it under the polite fiction of clearing glasses. The off-duty military police officer had appeared at his side without being asked, and the two of them had quietly cordoned off that corner of the room with nothing but their bodies and their bearing. The marked glass still stood behind the centerpiece, and I knew the staff would want to tidy it away, and I knew now it would not be touched. I crossed to Marlene, who had stayed close as she had promised, her face pale but composed. "I need you with Tyla," I said. "Ride with her if they will let you. Do not leave her alone, not for 1 minute, not with anyone you do not know." She nodded once, already moving, and I felt the relief of having one more anchor I could trust set down in the right place. The ambulance came at 34 minutes past 8. I know the time because I had looked at my watch again, the soldier's reflex marking the hour. The paramedics moved fast and clean. They got Tyla onto the stretcher, and her vitals were steadying under the oxygen. And one of them told me, with the careful neutrality of his trade, that her signs suggested she had ingested some kind of sedative, not a fatal amount, but a serious one, and that the hospital would run a screen to know for certain. He asked, almost as an afterthought, whether anyone knew how it had happened. I said, "The police will want to handle that." He looked at me a second longer, then nodded and went back to his work, and I understood from his face that the word police had told him a great deal. Before they wheeled her out, Tyla turned her head toward me, her eyes a little clearer now. "Sergeant Major," she said, her voice thick. "I'm sorry. I'm messing up your party." And something in me broke a little, quietly, where no one could see it. I leaned down close to her ear. "You did nothing wrong." I told her. "Do you hear me? Nothing. You are one of mine, and I am going to take care of this. Now go with these good people and let them help you." Marlene climbed in beside her, and the doors closed, and they were gone into the dark. I stood for a moment in the sudden quiet of the loading area, the night air cool on my face after the heat of the room, and I let myself feel, for exactly the length of one breath, the enormity of it. A young woman I loved like my own was in an ambulance because of a poison meant for me. My daughter had stood by while it was prepared. My son-in-law had handed me a glass and smiled. This was the wreckage of the life I had built, laid out under the gold lights of a room with my name on a banner. One breath, that was all I allowed it. Then I straightened my spine, smoothed the front of my navy dress, and turned back toward the building, because the night was not over, and I was the only one who fully understood that. Holloway was waiting for me just inside the doors. "The footage is secured, Ify," he said. "I pulled it before I let anyone near the system, and I have got the glass bagged. Both of them, the one she drank from and the one tucked behind the flowers." He paused, lowering his voice. "Ma'am, I have done this job 18 years. I know real when I see it. You were watching for this, weren't you? You knew." I looked at him, this stranger who had decided, in the space of 10 minutes, to be exactly the right kind of man. "I knew," I said. Then, somewhere behind me in the emptying room, I heard a sound that made me turn. It was the unmistakable, controlled, courtroom smooth voice of a man I had not invited. My lawyer had arrived. His name was Harold Webb, and he had handled my legal affairs for the better part of 15 years. And he was 71 years old and moved through the emptying room with the unhurried certainty of a man who had seen every kind of trouble a family could make for itself and been surprised by none of it. I had called him 3 days before the party. I had told him what I suspected, laid it out plainly, the questions and the probes and the word conservatorship, and I had told him I did not know what would happen on the night, but that I wanted him close and ready, and that if I called, he should come. He had listened in his dry, careful way and said only, "I will be there before you need me, Nora." And he was. He came to my side and looked at me over his glasses. "Is the young woman alive?" he asked first, because Harold's priorities had always been in the right order. "She is stable," I said, "on her way to the hospital." He nodded once. Then he said, "The police are coming. The paramedics will have filed it. They always do with a suspected ingestion, and Holloway here tells me he has already called them as well." "Good," I said. "Let them come." And then I let myself stand still for a moment and understand what I had done. The thing that nobody in that room had grasped, the thing Garrett would not grasp until it was far too late, was that the trap had never been his. He had believed he was the hunter. He had spent weeks, perhaps months, building his careful machine, choosing the occasion, choosing the timing, positioning himself by the drinks table, certain that he was leading a soft and unsuspecting old woman to her ruin. He did not understand that the moment I saw the shape of his plan, weeks before, in my kitchen, I had begun to build a larger one around it. I had let the party happen. That was the part that still sits strangely with me, even now. I could have refused to come. I could have raised the alarm beforehand, made accusations, demanded an investigation, and been met, I knew, with the gentle disbelieving pity the world reserves for frightened old women, the very thing that would have proved their case for them. A woman who cannot be reasoned with, a woman who imagines plots. So I had not done that. I had walked into the room he had prepared, and I had let him believe he was winning, right up until the moment the glass left his hand, because a trap only closes if the prey walks into it believing itself the predator. I had brought witnesses I trusted with my life. I had brought a lawyer. I had preserved a sample of the poison on my own person and ensured the glasses and the footage were secured. I had turned the instrument of my destruction aside and let it fall, terribly, on someone I loved. And that was a grief I would carry. But the machine he built had been turned to face him now, every part of it, across the room. Garrett was still performing. He had attached himself to a small cluster of guests near the windows and was shaking his head, saying something about how shocking it all was, how he hoped the poor girl would be all right. What a terrible thing to happen at such a lovely event. He was reassuring people. He was smoothing it over. He was, even now, with the police on their way, running the same play he had run for 6 years, the warm and steady son-in-law keeping everyone calm. He did not yet know that the calm was no longer his to manage. Vanessa had not moved far from the microphone stand. She stood alone, which told me a great deal, because a wife in the middle of a frightening evening goes to her husband, and she had not gone to hers. She was watching Garrett work the room, and her face was the face of a woman watching a stranger, watching a man she had perhaps only just understood. She did not know at all. Her eyes kept moving to me and away, to me and away, the helpless flickering of someone who wants to come toward you and cannot find the road. I would deal with my daughter, but not yet. There is an order to these things, and the order matters. I turned to Harold and Holloway and Doyle, who had drifted into a loose circle around me. My people, the ones I had gathered, I said. I am going to speak to my son-in-law, privately. Before the police arrive, I want one conversation with him, where he cannot perform for an audience and cannot run. Holloway said there was an anteroom off the main hall, a small, quiet space he could keep clear. Doyle said, I will bring him to you, Sergeant Major, in a tone that suggested Garrett would arrive whether he wished to or not. And Harold said, I will be just outside the door, and if he says anything that matters, I will hear it. I looked at the three of them, these men who had come because I called, and I felt something steady and enormous, the particular strength that comes not from standing alone, but from standing among people who have chosen, freely, to stand with you. I had spent so much of the last 2 years believing I was alone in this, carrying it in silence, writing it in a notebook no one would ever read. And here, at the end of it, I was not alone at all. I never had been. I had simply forgotten, for a while, that loyalty is a thing you bank over a lifetime, and that it pays out, faithfully, in the hour you need it most. Bring him to me, I said, and Doyle went to fetch the man who had tried to take my life, and my husband's last gift, and my own good mind, and bring him to the small, quiet room where I was waiting. The anteroom was small and plain, a folding table, a few stacked chairs, a window looking out on the dark parking lot and the lights of the base beyond. Doyle brought Garrett to the door and then stepped back to stand just outside it, arms folded, immovable as a bulkhead. I sat down at the folding table. I did not offer Garrett a chair. He could stand. He came in still wearing the mask, still performing, though I could see now that it had begun to slip at the corners, the way a thing slips when the hands holding it have started to sweat. "Mom," he said, "what is this? Why are we in here? That poor girl. Shouldn't we be out there?" I let him talk. I let him spend the performance, the way you let a man empty a magazine into the dark before you tell him you were never where he was shooting. When he ran out of words, the room went quiet. I folded my hands on the table and I looked at him, and I let the silence do its work, because silence is a pressure, and men like Garrett cannot bear it for long. He shifted his weight. He started to speak again, and I said, very simply, before he could, "Sit down." "Garrett." He sat. The sergeant major in my voice had done that. The one he had spent 6 years believing did not exist anymore, and I watched him register it, watched the first real flicker of fear move behind his eyes. "I know what you put in the glass," I said. I was quiet and even, the way I am at the worst moments, the way I have learned to be. I watched you at the table at 42 minutes past 7. I watched your hand. I saw the container. I saw you set the glass forward, apart from the others, marked, so that you could be the one to hand it to me when the toast came. I saw all of it. Garrett, I have been watching you for a very long time." His mouth opened. "Mom, I don't know what you think you saw, but you're confused. You've had a long night. This is exactly the kind of thing the doctors—" I switched the glass. The words landed in the small room like a stone dropped into still water, and I watched the ripples of them move across his face. He stopped. Everything stopped. "What?" he said. I switched the glass. I said again, "The one you marked. The one you put your poison in." I moved it behind the flowers before the toast, and I put a clean one in its place. The glass you so tenderly handed me, the one you watched me drink from, was never the one you prepared. And the one you prepared, the one Tyler Reyes is in an ambulance because of, I have a sample of it, sealed, on my person. I took it from your glass before I ever moved it. So whatever you used, it will be identified, and it will match what is in that young woman's blood, and it will match the residue in the glass that the head of security has already bagged and labeled, along with 90 minutes of footage that shows your hand quite clearly. I had never seen a man's face do what his did then. The performance did not crack so much as evaporate, simply lift away all at once, and what was left underneath was not a monster and not a frightened boy, but something colder and emptier than both. The bare machinery of a man who had only ever been calculating, stripped now of anything to calculate with. "You can't. He started and stopped." "You don't have." "I have all of it," I said. "I have had most of it for 2 years." And that was when I reached into my clutch and set the notebook on the table between us. Army green, soft at the corners, the little book he had picked up not 2 hours earlier and turned over in his hands and called a security blanket. I watched him recognize it. I watched him remember mocking it, the indulgent smile, the apps they make for this now. I opened it, unhurried, to a page I knew by heart, and I turned it to face him. Every withdrawal, I said, dated the $4,000 in March of last year, the $11,000 in August routed through an account in a name I did not recognize until I made some calls. The questions Vanessa asked about my will, transcribed the same evening, with the dates. The afternoon I came home and found my papers had been moved. The name of your friend who handles estate matters, who I also looked into, Garrett, and who has done this before with other families, with other old women who were not as careful as you assumed I would be. I turned another page. And the survivor's benefit, I said, and my voice did change then, just slightly, just for that one line, because there are things a person cannot keep entirely level. Raymond's money, the money I have never touched in 34 years. You went looking for that. You found out about it and you decided it should be yours. That, Garrett, more than any of the rest of it, is the thing I will never forgive. He stared at the notebook. He stared at the steady columns of a dying habit he had laughed at, the careful hand of the foolish old woman, which had become the most complete record of his crimes that any prosecutor could have asked for. You scribbled in your little book, he said faintly, almost to himself, the words coming out hollow. Yes, I said I did. And then the door opened behind him, and I looked up, and standing in the doorway, white-faced, having heard God knew how much, was my daughter. She must have followed Doyle, or perhaps some instinct older than thought had simply pulled her toward the room where her mother and her husband had disappeared. However she came to be there, she stood in the doorway now with one hand pressed flat against the frame as though she needed it to stay upright. And her eyes moved from me to Garrett, to the green notebook open on the table between us. And I watched her try to assemble the pieces into something she could survive. Vanessa, Garrett said, and the speed with which he reached for her told me everything. Vanessa, don't listen to her. She's not well. You know she's not well. We've talked about this. She's been confused for... Stop, Vanessa said. It was barely a word. It came out cracked and small. But it stopped him, because she had never said it to him like that before. I understood at once. She had spent years saying yes to this man, agreeing, deferring, looking away. And now she had said stop, and the single syllable seemed to cost her everything she had. She came into the room on unsteady legs. She looked at the notebook. I turned it a few degrees toward her, not speaking, letting the dates and the figures and my own steady handwriting say what I did not need to. She read. I watched her read. I watched her eyes move down the columns, the withdrawals she must have known about, the ones she had perhaps told herself were something else, an investment, a misunderstanding, a thing her husband had explained away in that warm, certain voice. I watched her come to the entries about herself, the questions she had asked me, transcribed in my hand with the dates beside them, and I watched her recognize her own words and understand, finally, what she had been a part of. Mom, she said. Her voice broke on the single syllable. I didn't know about, I thought he said. I know. I said. And I did know. That was the terrible thing. I had known for a while. He told you I was slipping? I said. He told you I was getting confused, forgetting things, that I needed to be protected from myself. He had you asking me those questions so that later you could swear in good faith that you had been worried for a long time. He used your love for me as a tool. Vanessa, he turned the best thing in you into a weapon and aimed it at me, and you never saw it because you trusted him, and because somewhere along the way he had taught you not to trust yourself. She made a sound I had not heard from her since she was a small girl, a raw, helpless sound, and her hand came up over her mouth. And there was one thing more, I said, because she had to hear all of it, and she had to hear it from me, not from a courtroom, not from a stranger. He told you that I disapproved of him, of your marriage. He told you I had said things, that I had never accepted him, that I was trying to come between you. Didn't he? Her eyes flew to mine, and in them I saw the confirmation, and I saw the exact moment the architecture of 6 years began to come down inside her, because that lie had been the foundation of all the rest. That was how he had done it, how he had taken my daughter from me an inch at a time. The missed Sunday dinners, the calls that came only when he was not home, the slow cooling of a closeness I had not known how to fight, because I could not name the thing that was killing it. He had stood between us and told each of us a different story about the other, and we had both believed him, because he was charming and certain, and we were each, in our own way, afraid of losing her. I never said those things. I told her. Not one of them. I have wanted you back for 6 years, Vanessa, and I did not know how to reach you, because every time I tried, the woman who came to the phone was a woman who had been told her mother did not love her husband and was trying to break up her marriage. I lost you to a lie, and tonight he was willing to put me in the ground, or worse, to put me under his control with the judge's signature and take everything, including your father's money. The last thing I had of the man who loved us both. He was willing to do all of that, and he had you believing it was concern. Vanessa turned to look at her husband. I will remember her face for the rest of my life. There was no anger in it yet. That would come later. The anger comes after, when the shock wears off. In that moment, there was only the bottomless vertigo of a person who has just discovered that the ground they have stood on for years was never there at all, that the hand they trusted had been at their back the whole time, pushing. She looked at Garrett, and Garrett looked back at her, and I watched him make one last calculation, watched him reach for the warm voice, the steady reassurance, the play that had never once failed him in all the years she had known him. Baby, he said, you know me. You know I would never. And Vanessa said, very quietly, where did the $11,000 go? Garrett? He had no answer. For the first time in 6 years, I watched my son-in-law open his mouth and find nothing inside it. The warm voice was gone. The certainty was gone. There was only a man at a folding table in a small plain room, with a green notebook open in front of him, and a wife who had finally, far too late and not too late at all, asked him a question he could not talk his way out of, and somewhere out in the main hall, a door opened, and I heard the measured footsteps of people who had come to do their duty. The police had arrived. The 2 officers came into the anteroom the way trained people come into a room they do not yet understand. Quietly, with their eyes moving first. The one in front was a woman, perhaps 40, with a calm steadiness I recognized because I had spent 40 years around people who carried it. Her name was Officer Dana Whitfield. Her partner, younger, stayed near the door. I did not wait to be asked. I had learned long ago that the first clear voice in a confused room often becomes the one people trust, and I had no intention of letting that voice be Garrett's. I told her my name. I told her it was my birthday party, and that the woman who had been taken to the hospital was a friend and a former soldier of mine. Then I told her, plainly, what I had security footage that showed a man place a substance into a champagne glass at 42 minutes past 7. 2 glasses, both already bagged by the head of security, a sample I had collected myself into a clean bottle, and a notebook with 2 years of financial records that explained why any of it had happened. Officer Whitfield looked at me for a long moment. I have been looked at that way before, by people deciding whether the calm older woman in front of them is reliable or simply unwell. I held her gaze and let her decide. Behind me, Harold Webb stepped forward and introduced himself as my attorney, and something in her shoulders settled. Holloway confirmed, in the flat voice of a man who had secured a great many things in his life, that the evidence was intact and the footage preserved. And through all of it, Garrett kept talking. He was good. I will give him that. The way you give credit to a storm for being thorough. He spoke of confusion and of his concern for my health. He used the word episode. He said it gently, the way he had said everything gently for 6 years. And I watched the younger officer's face flicker, just slightly, toward belief. That was the moment it could have turned. That is always the moment. And it was Vanessa who turned it. She had been standing between us this whole time. My daughter. In the place she had occupied for 6 years, without ever knowing it was a place. Between her husband and her mother. Between the story she had been told and the one written in my notebook in figures she had just read with her own eyes. Garrett looked at her. He did not have to say it. The look said it for him. Stand with me. Say she is confused. We can still walk out of this. I did not ask her to choose. I went that to be understood. I had spent the night fighting for her without her knowing, and I would have gone on fighting whatever she decided. A mother does not love conditionally. She loves, and then she lives with what the love costs. But she chose anyway. She did not choose me exactly. I have thought about this often since. She did not run into my arms or denounce her husband. What she did was smaller and far braver than that. She stopped believing him. I watched it happen on her face. The slow collapse of a story she had built her life on. And when it was gone, she simply turned away from him, toward me, and asked the only question that mattered. What do I do, Mom? It had been a long time since she called me that and meant it. I told her the truth, because the truth was the only thing I had left to give her that he had not already stolen. I told her to tell these officers exactly what she knew, all of it, the questions she had been asked to ask me, the papers she had signed without reading, the man her husband had called a friend. I told her I would be right here, and that telling the truth was not a betrayal of her marriage. It was the first honest thing she had done inside it. She cried then, not the practiced tears I had seen at family dinners, the ones meant to end an argument. These came from somewhere older, somewhere I recognized, because I had cried that way myself the year her father died, and I understood that I would have to carry everything alone. I didn't know, she said. Mom, I swear I didn't know. I know, I told her, and I did. I am still here. Officer Whitfield, to her credit, understood what she was watching. She gently separated my daughter from the rest of the room, taking her statement apart from Garrett so that nothing he could see or signal would shape a single word of it. Harold moved with them, quietly, making certain that whatever Vanessa said was given in a way that protected her even as it told the truth. Garrett watched his wife walk to the far corner of the room and begin, in a low and shaking voice, to dismantle everything he had built. I watched his face as he realized she was gone, not gone to me, gone from him. The difference was everything, and he knew it. The younger officer stepped closer to him then, not roughly, just close enough that the meaning was clear. I heard the older one, Officer Whitfield, murmur something to her partner, and the partner nodded and reached for the cuffs at his belt. The night was almost over, but not quite. There was still the matter of taking Garrett out of that room, and I already knew I was going to make myself watch it. They read him his rights in the small plain room, the woman officer's voice flat and even, the words that everyone has heard 1,000 times on television, and that land entirely differently when they are spoken to someone you once carved a turkey beside at Thanksgiving. Garrett stood when they asked him to. He put his hands behind his back when they asked him to. The performer in him had not entirely died even then, because I watched him arrange his face into something wounded and dignified. A man bearing up under a terrible misunderstanding. And I knew he was already composing the version of this he would tell, the one where he was the victim of a vindictive old woman and a hysterical wife. It would not save him. I knew that, standing there. The footage alone would not save him, and there was so much more than the footage. But I let him have the expression, because a man's last dignity is sometimes only a costume, and I had no need to tear it off him. I had what I needed. He had reached for my husband's money and my own good mind, and he was leaving this room in handcuffs. And that was enough. He looked at me once as they turned him toward the door. I had wondered, in the weeks before, what I would feel in this moment if it ever came. I had imagined triumph. I had imagined fury. What I felt instead, looking at my son-in-law in handcuffs, was a kind of vast and weary sadness, because he was a young man who had been given a place at a family's table, real love, real welcome, my daughter's whole devoted heart, and he had looked at all of it and seen only assets. He had been handed a life and had decided to steal one instead. There is no triumph in watching that. There is only the grief of all the things that did not have to happen this way. "You forgot," he said to me, low, as they moved him past. "The notebook. You forgot I'd seen it. You let me think it was nothing." "No," I said. "I did not forget. I let you believe you understood it, which is a different thing entirely. You looked at 40 years of habit and saw a foolish old woman. That was your mistake. Garrett, it was always going to be your mistake. You could never imagine that the thing you were looking at was sharper than you were." And then he was gone, out the door, between the two officers, through the emptied hall where a banner still hung that read "Happy Birthday, Nora, 66 years," and out into the night. The scope of what he had done would take weeks to fully surface. I will tell you now what the forensic accountants found later, because you have come this far, and you deserve to know the whole shape of it. The $11,000 Vanessa had asked about was the smallest part. Over 2.5 years, Garrett had moved money in small, careful increments through an account belonging to a shell company that existed only as a name and a number, draining the savings he and my daughter had built, and a good deal more besides. The estate friend who handled such matters turned out to be a man known to investigators, a man who had done precisely this with other families, other aging parents, other untouched accounts. Garrett had not been improvising. He had been the local hand of something larger and uglier, a quiet industry that preys on the old and the trusting, and my birthday had simply been the day his particular piece of it was meant to pay out. But that was later, that night, after they took him. There was only the emptied room and the wilting narcissus and my daughter, sitting in a chair near the windows where Harold had settled her after her statement, looking smaller than I had seen her look since she was a girl. I went and sat down beside her. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Out the window, the lights of the base burned steady and indifferent, the way the world always is, enormous and unconcerned with the small catastrophes unfolding inside its lit rooms. "I let her marry him, Mom," she finally said. "You tried to." "No. You didn't even try to warn me because he made sure you couldn't. He took you away from me so you couldn't tell me what you saw." She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. How did I not see it? How did I sit across from him every day and not see it? "Because you loved him," I said, "and because people like Garrett do not survive by being obvious. They survive by being exactly what each person needs them to be. You did not fail to see a monster. Vanessa, you loved a man who showed you only the face that would keep you. That is not the same as being a fool. I should know. I raised you to trust the people you love. I will not now turn around and tell you that trusting was your sin." She turned and looked at me, her face ruined and open. "I don't know how to come back from this," she said. "I don't even know if you want me to." "There is no version of this," I said, "where you are not my daughter. None. There is no amount of time and no amount of damage that changes that single fact. We have a long road, you and I. We are going to have to learn how to talk to each other again. And some of those conversations are going to be very hard. And I am not going to pretend otherwise. But you are mine. You have always been mine. And I have been waiting 6 years for you to find your way back to this chair. She leaned into me then, the way she had not done since she was small, and I put my arm around my daughter, and we sat together in the wreckage of the party that had tried to be something beautiful. And outside, the long night finally began to end. I woke the next morning at the hour I have woken for 40 years, a little before dawn, before the alarm, before the light. For one merciful moment, I did not remember. There was only the gray window and the familiar weight of the blanket and the quiet of a house I had lived in alone for a long time. Then it came back, all of it. The flute set forward and apart on the white cloth, Tyla folding toward the floor, my daughter's face in the anteroom, white as paper, asking me what she should do. The anger came first. It came hot and fast, the way it does, and for a few minutes I let it. I lay in my bed and I was furious, furious at Garrett, furious at the man who had taught him, furious at a world that lets people hunt the old and the trusting as though we were not still here, still thinking, still ourselves. I have learned not to be ashamed of that anger. It is the body's way of insisting that something wrong has been done. But anger is a fire, and fire burns down to something quieter. And underneath mine, when it had burned low, was grief, plain and heavy. My daughter had let a man convince her I was her enemy. She had stood beside him for 6 years, while he prepared to take everything her father had left us. The anger I could survive. It was the grief that made me get up, because I have never been able to lie still inside it. I made coffee. I stood at the kitchen window in my old robe and watched the dark thin out over the garden. And then I did the thing I do when I need to remember who I am. I took out Raymond's letters. There is a cedar box in my bedroom that holds everything that matters. The folded flag, a photograph of a young sergeant squinting into the sun, and a small bundle of letters written in his careful hand across the 4 years we had together, from 1979 until the spring he died. I have read them so many times the creases are soft as cloth. I unfolded the one I always return to. He had written it the week Vanessa was born, in the winter of 1982, while I was still in the base hospital with our daughter in my arms, and him not yet sent to the place that would take him. The ink has faded, but the words have not. You are the strongest person I have ever known, he wrote. I have watched you walk through things that would have broken anyone else, and you do it without asking to be carried. I am not afraid of anything in this life except the day you might forget that. I sat with that line a long time in the gray morning, because that, I understood now, was exactly what they had tried to take. Not only the money, not only the house and the survivor's benefit I had carried untouched for 34 years. They had tried to take the thing Raymond had named in that letter. They had tried to make me forget that I was strong. They had built a careful machine designed to convince a court, and worse, to convince me that I had grown confused, that I could no longer be trusted with my own life. A man I had welcomed to my table had looked at a woman who commanded soldiers for 40 years and seen only a target soft enough to take. I will not forget. That was the decision I made at the kitchen window, with the coffee going cold and my husband's handwriting under my thumb. Whatever else this cost me, and it would cost me, I would not let them have that. I would not let them make me small. At 7 o'clock, I called Harold Webb. I know what it is to call a lawyer at 7 in the morning. The day after, it announces something about the kind of woman you intend to be. Harold answered on the second ring, already awake, the way good ones are. I told him I was ready. I told him I wanted 3 things to begin at once. I wanted the criminal case built carefully and completely, every dollar traced, including the man who had taught Garrett his trade, because I had no intention of letting this end with one son-in-law when there were other mothers out there being measured for the same trap. I wanted the civil recovery started so that what had been stolen would be returned, not for my sake, but because Raymond's money was meant for a purpose, and that purpose was not Garrett's freedom. And I told him, more quietly, that there would be matters concerning my daughter, and that I needed his help to handle those with both honesty and mercy. Harold listened the way he always does, without interrupting, and when I finished, he said only that he would have the first papers ready by the end of the week. Then he paused and added something he did not have to. He said that in 30 years of this work, he had rarely seen anyone come through such a night and call him the next morning so clear about what they wanted. I told him I had had a good teacher. I did not say it was a dead man and a box of letters. He did not need to know that part. When I hung up, the light had come up fully over the garden. The frost was off the grass, along the back fence, where I had planted bulbs in the autumn without much faith that I would care by spring. There were green shoots pushing up through the dark soil. Small things, easy to miss. The first ordinary promise of a season that had not yet arrived. I stood there in my old robe and looked at them for a long while. It was the first ordinary thought I had had in a very long time. I held on to it. In the weeks that followed, I learned that grief and justice do not move at the same speed. Justice is slow. It fills out forms and waits for signatures. Grief arrives all at once, usually at the kitchen table, usually before the coffee is finished. It was Marlene who said it to me, the morning after the worst of it. She had stayed the night on my couch, the way she had stayed beside me through 40 years of harder things than this. She set a mug in front of me and said the part no one else would. The hardest part, she told me, would not be the trial or the lawyers or the looks from people who had heard. The hardest part would be each morning, when I woke up and remembered all over again that my daughter had let it happen. She was right. She was right the way she had always been right, plainly and without flinching. Harold Webb called 3 days later. The forensic accountants had finished their first pass, and the numbers were worse than I had let myself believe. The $11,000 that had broken Vanessa's voice in the anteroom had not been the wound. It had been a single drop of blood that pointed toward the artery. Over 2.5 years. Garrett had moved more than $200,000 out of accounts he should never have been able to touch. Some of it through a shell company with a name that meant nothing. Some of it through fees and transfers and signatures he had coached me toward gently over dinners while he called me Mom. And the worst of it, Harold told me carefully, was that Garrett had not invented the scheme. He had learned it. There was a man, an operator the investigators already knew by name, who made his living teaching people exactly this: how to find a widow with assets and time, how to befriend the family, how to ask the kind questions that, written down later, made a sharp woman look confused, how to build a case for a conservatorship before the woman ever knew she was a target. My notebook, the army green one Garrett had laughed at and called my security blanket, became the backbone of the case. 2 years of dates and figures and quoted questions, written in a hand he had assumed was failing. Harold said it plainly. Without that notebook, it would have been my word against theirs. With it, it was no longer a question of whether, only of how much and how long. Then Harold told me the thing I had been dreading since the anteroom. If the investigation followed every thread, it could reach my daughter. Vanessa had signed papers. Vanessa had asked me questions she now knew had been fed to her. A prosecutor with no mercy and a point to prove could decide she had been a knowing part of it. She had not been. I believed that the way I believed in very few things anymore. But belief is not evidence, and the law does not run on a mother's certainty. So there it was, the choice I had not wanted. I could let it run. I could let the full weight of it fall where it landed, and some of it would land on her, and a part of me, the part that had watched her stand beside that man for 6 years, wanted it to. I will not pretend otherwise. There is a kind of anger that feels like justice when you are tired enough. But I had spent 40 years learning the difference between justice and revenge. Justice fixes what it can and protects who it must. Revenge only wants company in the dark. I told Harold to build the case against Garrett and the man who taught him, and to draw a clean line around Vanessa. Not to erase what she had done, to protect her from paying for a crime she had not chosen, while making certain she did the harder work of facing the one she had. I would not prosecute my own daughter. I would also not absolve her with a hug and a closed door. She would unlearn this. She would sit across from a counselor and say out loud how she had let a man convince her that her own mother was the enemy. She would do the slow, unglamorous work of becoming someone who could not be fooled that way again. That was not mercy. Mercy would have been easier. It was the only thing I knew that might actually heal her. Harold was quiet for a moment on the line. Then he said it was the right call, and that not many people would have made it. I told him I had not made it to be admired. I had made it because she was still my daughter, and because the money they had wanted. Raymond's money, the survivor's benefit I had carried untouched for 34 years, had been meant for exactly this, not for greed. For the moment, a family had to choose what kind of family it would be. I hung up and sat in the quiet of my kitchen, the morning light moving slow across the floor. The phone rang again almost at once. I almost did not answer it. It was Tyla. Her voice was thin but steady, the voice of a woman who had nearly died at a birthday party and had decided to live loudly because of it. She said she was out of the hospital. She said she had been thinking, lying in that bed, about all the women who never had a notebook, about all the ones who never had a Holloway, a Doyle, a Marlene. Then she said there was something we were supposed to do, and I knew, the way I had known certain things across 40 years before anyone said them out loud, that whatever it was, I was going to say yes. Tyla came to the house that Saturday. She arrived in civilian clothes, jeans and a jacket, and she looked healthy, color back in her face, steady on her feet, and the sight of her standing whole on my porch undid something in me that I had been holding tight since the night of the party. I had carried a guilt about Tyla that no amount of reasoning could fully dissolve. The poison had been meant for me. She had drunk it because she happened to reach for the wrong glass in a room where I had set a trap. I had turned the weapon aside and it had fallen on one of my own. And I do not think I will ever entirely make peace with that. I told her so at my kitchen table, because she deserved the truth and not a comfortable version of it. She listened the way good soldiers listen, all the way to the end. And then she shook her head. "Ma'am," she said, with respect, "you have got that exactly backward. You did not put that in my glass." He did. "You are the reason I am sitting here at all, because you are the reason there was a sample and footage and a case, and the reason he is going to answer for it instead of walking away clean to do it to somebody else." She leaned forward. I have been lying in that hospital bed thinking about it, about how many people this happens to who do not have a Sergeant Major Brandt watching the room. Old people, sick people, people whose families decide they have become inconvenient or expensive and who get quietly signed away, and nobody switches the glass for them. Nobody is watching. I said nothing because she had walked on her own all the way to the place I had been walking toward myself. "That is the thing I want to talk to you about," she said. "I did some reading in that bed. Conservatorship abuse, financial exploitation of the elderly. It is everywhere, ma'am. It is one of the most common crimes there is, and one of the least talked about, because the victims are people the world has already decided to stop listening to." And I kept thinking, you knew what to do. You knew how to see it, how to document it, how to protect yourself. Most people do not. They have no idea. And I thought, somebody should teach them. Somebody should stand up for the ones who cannot switch their own glass. And she looked at me. This young woman I had once read off as a lost cause from a folder of disciplinary notes. And she said, "I think it should be us." I have started a great many things in my life. Units, programs, careers, the long, slow building of other people into who they were meant to be. I know the feeling of a true thing beginning, the particular click of it, like a round seating home. I felt it then, at my kitchen table, with the spring light coming through the window and a recovered soldier looking at me with my own fire in her eyes. We started small, the way real things start. We called it, after some argument, the Brandt Project, because Tyla insisted and I was too tired to keep refusing. We began by doing the one thing I knew how to do better than almost anyone alive, which was to take something complicated and frightening and break it down into steps a person could actually follow. How to recognize the questions that are really probes. How to keep records. How to secure your own documents and your own accounts. What conservatorship actually is and how the laws work in our state, and what your rights are and who you can call. The unglamorous, practical, life-saving knowledge that the woman from my church had never had, and that might have saved her if she had. We held the first session in the back room of a church, 11 people in folding chairs, most of them women, most of them my age or older, all of them carrying that particular wary loneliness I knew from the inside. I stood up in front of them, and I did not give them a speech. I told them the truth. I told them what had happened at my own birthday party. I told them about the questions that were too kind, and the word that arrived in my kitchen, and the glass, and the notebook. I told them that I was 66 years old and that a man had looked at me and seen something small and easy, and that he had been wrong, and that they were not small or easy either, no matter who had taught them to believe they were. You are not finished. I told that room full of faces. The world will try to tell you that you are. It will dress the message up as concern. It will put a gentle hand on your arm. Do not let it make you forget what you know about yourself. Write things down. Trust the instinct that goes quiet and watchful when something is wrong. And know that there are people who will stand with you, because there are. Afterward, an old woman in a blue cardigan took both my hands in hers, the way the colonel had taken mine at the party, and she could not speak for a moment. And then she said, I thought I was the only one. And Tyla, across the room, caught my eye, and I understood that the thing we had begun was real, and that it would outlast me, which is, in the end, the only kind of thing worth beginning. The dogwoods were blooming by then. The hard winter of it all had given way, as winters do, to something tentative and green. I drove home from that first session with the windows down and the warm air moving through the car, and for the first time since the night of the party, I was not bracing for anything. I was simply going home to plant my garden. My garden came in that spring, the way grief gives way to living, slowly, and then all at once. I had planted tomatoes and marigolds and a row of beans along the back fence, and I spent my mornings out there with dirt under my nails and the sun on the back of my neck. And I found that my hands, which had held a folded flag and a green notebook and a frightened soldier's fingers, were just as content holding a trowel. There is a particular peace in tending something that asks nothing of you but patience. Vanessa came on Sundays now. Not every Sunday, not yet, and not always easily. We were two people relearning how to be in a room together after a lie had stood between us for 6 years. And some afternoons the conversation flowed, and some afternoons it caught and snagged on all the things we were still afraid to say. But she came. She would kneel beside me in the garden in her good clothes, not caring, and we would work side by side. And sometimes we did not talk at all, and that was its own kind of healing. The divorce was moving through the courts. She was building a life that was hers, not his, and watching her do it, watching my daughter slowly become a woman who trusted her own judgment again, was the truest reward of everything that had happened. It was unfinished. Redemption usually is, but it was real, and it was ours, and it was moving in the right direction. I want to tell you what I have learned, because you have stayed with me through all of it, and you deserve more than a story. You deserve the thing the story was for. I spent a lifetime being underestimated by men who outranked me and should have known better, by a world that looks at a woman of a certain age and decides, before she has said a word, that her best chapters are behind her, that composure means passivity, that patience means weakness, that because she does not shout, she cannot fight. And at the very end, by a man who married into my family and looked at me across a Thanksgiving table and saw nothing but a balance to be transferred and a mind to be discredited. Every one of them was wrong. If you are listening to this, and you are a woman who has begun to feel the world quietly deciding you are finished, I want you to hear me, because I am talking to you now and to no one else. You are not finished. The gray in your hair is 40, 60, 70 years of surviving things that would have broken people who never learned your strength. Your patience is not weakness. It is a weapon that has been sharpened on every hard year you have lived. The instinct that goes quiet and watchful when something is wrong is not paranoia. It is the most reliable thing you own. And the people who tell you to ignore it are almost always the ones who benefit from your silence. Write things down. Trust what you see. And know that the love you have given, all those years of it, the sleep and the savings and the whole devoted heart, is not a debt anyone is allowed to collect against your dignity. It was a gift. It does not make you owe them your freedom. My husband wrote to me, across all those years and all that distance, that the only thing in the world he feared was the day I might forget that I was the strongest person he had ever known. I came very close this past year to a room where they meant to make me forget it forever, with a glass of champagne and a judge's signature. I did not forget. And the reason I did not in the end was not my training or my cunning or even the green notebook. It was him. It was Vanessa as a baby. It was every soldier I ever carried and every promise I ever kept. It was a whole life's worth of reasons to stay sharp, to stay awake, to refuse to be made small. Love, it turns out, was never the lever they thought it was. They believed my love for my daughter was the weakness they could pry me open with. They were wrong about that, too. My love was the reason I was watching the room in the first place. It was the reason I saw the hand move wrong. It was, in the end, the thing that saved us both. I am 66 years old. I have buried a husband and raised a daughter, and commanded soldiers, and survived a betrayal that came dressed as a birthday party, and I am not done. I have a garden to tend and a daughter to walk home, and a room full of frightened, magnificent women who are just beginning to learn that they were never as small as the world told them they were. If this story found something in you, if it touched a fear you carry quietly, or a strength you had begun to forget, then sit with it for a moment before you go. And then tell me, in your own words, where you are listening from, and one thing you have survived that the world never gave you credit for. I want to know. I want this to be a room where we say it out loud. And if you know a woman who needs to hear that she is not finished, that her instincts are sound and her dignity is not for sale, share this with her. Stay close to the people who would switch the glass for you and be that person for someone else. Because dignity does not retire. It does not muster out. It waits, quiet and watchful, for the day you need it. And it will be there. It was always there. It was you all along.